watcher in the woods. Gina Smith had always considered herself a city girl. Growing up in Detroit, Michigan, her world was defined by the hum of car engines, the beat of Motown music, and the gritty yet vibrant energy of the Motor City. Detroit was a place of resilience, a city that had been knocked down time and time again, but always got back up. Gina loved its towering skyscrapers, its Art Deco architecture, and the endless expanse of urban life. But there was a part of her that longed for something quieter, something untouched by humanity. That's what brought her to the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula on a crisp October weekend. Her friend Cassie had convinced her to join a small group for a camping trip, promising it would be a refreshing escape from city life. The others were Cassie's boyfriend Tom and his younger brother Nate. Gina wasn't particularly close with the latter two, but she agreed, thinking the change of pace might do her good. The day had started out idyllic. The group arrived at Huron National Forest late in the morning, hiking to a remote campsite nestled deep in the woods. The trees were ablaze with autumn colors, fiery reds, burnt oranges, and golden yellows. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Gina found herself relaxing in the quiet, enjoying the sharp contrast to Detroit's bustling streets. By the time the sun began to set, they had set up camp near a small clearing. A fire crackled in the center, sending spirals of smoke into the darkening sky. Cassie and Tom were laughing over some inside joke, while Nate whittled a stick with a pocket knife. Gina sat quietly, sipping from a mug of hot cider and staring into the flames. That's when she noticed it, the silence. The woods, which had been alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves, had gone unnervingly still. Even the wind seemed to have vanished. Gina felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Cassie stopped laughing. "Hear what?" "Exactly," Gina replied. "It's quiet." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Tom shrugged it off. "Probably just a coyote nearby. They scare off smaller animals." Gina wasn't so sure. She had read about the myths of the Upper Peninsula, stories of strange creatures that roamed the woods, passed down by the region's indigenous peoples. One legend in particular came to mind, the Skinwalker. According to folklore, it was a malevolent being that could take on the appearance of animals or even humans, often stalking its prey before attacking. She pushed the thought aside, not wanting to seem paranoid. Later that evening, Gina wandered a short distance from the camp to gather more firewood. The others were preoccupied, and she needed some space to clear her head. As she bent to pick up a fallen branch, a chill ran through her. She had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Slowly, she turned her head. There, just beyond the edge of her flashlight beam, was a figure. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a deer, perhaps. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized it was something far worse. The creature stood partially hidden behind a tree, its emaciated body covered in mottled, pale skin. Its eyes glowed faintly, like two dull coals, fixed unblinkingly on her. Gina's breath caught in her throat. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the shadows, but the longer she stared, the more real it became. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched her. Her hand tightened around the flashlight, her pulse pounding in her ears. Without breaking eye contact, she began to back away, her boots crunching on the dry leaves. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost curiously, but didn't follow. Gina turned and ran, her heart hammering in her chest. Back at camp, she tried to explain what she'd seen. "It was watching me," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human." Tom looked skeptical. "You're probably just spooked. The woods can play tricks on you." "Gina doesn't scare easily," Cassie said, her expression serious. "If she says she saw something, we should listen." They decided to stay close to the fire for the rest of the night, their earlier laughter replaced by uneasy silence. Gina couldn't shake the image of the creature from her mind, its hollow eyes, its unnatural stillness. As the hours dragged on, the tension became unbearable. At one point, they heard rustling in the trees, followed by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. The creature was nearby. "We need to leave," Gina said. her voice firm. Now. But the forest was vast, and the trails difficult to navigate in the dark. Without cell service and miles from the nearest town, they were effectively stranded. As dawn approached, they made their move, extinguishing the fire and packing up their gear as quickly as possible. Gina led the way, flashlight in hand, her every nerve on edge. The hike back to the main road was grueling. The creature stalked them the entire way, its pale form flickering in and out of sight among the trees. At one point, it lunged at Nate, its clawed hand grazing his shoulder. He screamed, stumbling forward as Tom and Gina pulled him away. "We're not going to make it," Nate gasped, his face pale. "Yes, we will," Gina snapped, refusing to give in to fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged onto the road. The sight of the empty asphalt brought tears to Gina's eyes. They flagged down a passing car, a lone trucker who didn't ask questions as they piled into the cab. As the truck rumbled away, Gina glanced back at the forest. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the creature standing at the tree line, its hollow eyes watching them. But then, it was gone, and the woods returned to their deceptive calm. Back in Detroit, Gina couldn't shake the events of that night. The city's familiar sounds and sights felt comforting, but the memory of the skinwalker lingered. She couldn't explain what she'd seen, but one thing was certain: she would never underestimate the woods again. Winter Watcher. Chuck Stallone wasn't particularly fond of road trips, especially in winter, but when his old college friends pitched the idea of exploring the Appalachian Mountains, he reluctantly agreed. Chuck, a Denver native, was no stranger to snow-capped peaks and rugged terrain. Growing up at the foot of the Rockies, he had spent countless weekends skiing, hiking, and soaking in the crisp mountain air. Denver was a city of contradictions, bustling urban life surrounded by serene wilderness. It was a balance he loved. But the Appalachians? That was a different beast altogether. Older, more mysterious, with a history shrouded in eerie tales and folklore. The group consisted of Chuck, his best friend, Danny, Danny's girlfriend, Liz, and a newcomer to their circle, Sam, a quiet guy who worked with Danny. The plan was simple: drive into the mountains, spend a day exploring, and head back before the roads got too icy. But plans, as Chuck would soon discover, had a way of unraveling. The snow began falling shortly after they arrived at their destination, a secluded trailhead deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The air was frigid, each breath forming a misty cloud as they trudged through the snow. The forest was dense, with towering pines and skeletal oaks stretching toward a leaden sky. Despite the biting cold, Chuck found himself marveling at the landscape. There was a stillness here, an ancient silence that felt both peaceful and unnerving. By late afternoon, the group reached a clearing with a partially frozen creek. They decided to set up a small fire and rest before heading back to their car. Chuck sat near the fire, flipping through the notes on his phone. Over the years, he had developed a fascination with cryptids, particularly Bigfoot. He had read countless reports of sightings in the Appalachians, fishermen glimpsing massive, hairy figures at the water's edge, hikers hearing guttural growls in the distance. It was easy to dismiss them as hoaxes, but standing here, surrounded by the vast, untamed wilderness, Chuck felt a flicker of doubt. "You really believe in that stuff?" Danny asked, catching a glimpse of Chuck's notes. "Not sure," Chuck admitted, "but there are enough stories to make you wonder." Liz rolled her eyes. "Stories are just that, stories. Besides, if Bigfoot's real, don't you think someone would have caught one by now?" Sam, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Maybe it doesn't want to be found." The conversation ended there, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The first sign of trouble came as the sun dipped below the horizon. Liz had wandered a short distance to take photos of the creek when they heard her scream. Chuck and the others bolted toward the sound, finding her standing frozen, pointing at the tree line. "It was there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something huge, watching me." "What did it look like?" Chuck asked, his stomach tightening. Liz hesitated. Like a man, but not. It was covered in hair, and its eyes, they were glowing. Danny laughed nervously. You're probably just spooked. The shadows play tricks in the snow. But Chuck knew better. He scanned the forest, his eyes searching for movement, but the encroaching darkness revealed nothing. They decided to head back to the car before the situation could escalate. But as they packed up, Chuck spotted it, a massive figure lurking at the edge of the clearing. It was impossibly tall, its broad shoulders hunched, its body covered in dark, matted fur. The creature stepped forward, its glowing eyes fixed on the group. "Run!" Chuck shouted, grabbing Liz's arm as they bolted toward the trail. The creature didn't follow immediately, but its guttural growl echoed through the forest, chilling them to the bone. Snow began falling heavier, obscuring their path and making every step a struggle. By the time they reached the car, Sam was gone. They waited in the car, hoping Sam had somehow gotten ahead of them. Minutes turned into an hour, and the snowfall grew into a blizzard. They couldn't call the police. There was no signal this deep in the mountains. Chuck's mind raced with possibilities, but none of them ended well. The creature had taken Sam, of that he was certain. "We can't just sit here," Danny said. "We need to find him." "Are you insane?" Liz snapped. "It's out there. We can't leave him," Chuck interjected, grabbing a flashlight. "But we need a plan." They retraced their steps, calling Sam's name into the howling wind. The forest felt alive, its branches creaking and groaning under the weight of the snow. Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was hurting them, forcing them deeper into its territory. Hours later, they stumbled upon a small cave. Inside, they found Sam, alive but shaken. His jacket was torn, and his face was pale. "It took me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It dragged me here, but it left. I don't know why." Chuck didn't want to find out. They helped Sam to his feet and started back toward the car, but the creature wasn't done with them. It attacked as they crossed a narrow ridge, lunging from the shadows with terrifying speed. Danny shoved Liz out of the way, taking the brunt of the impact. The two went tumbling into the snow, disappearing into the darkness. Chuck shouted Danny's name, but there was no response, only the growls of the creature and the fading sound of the struggle. "Go!" Sam yelled, pulling Chuck and Liz forward. By dawn, they reached the car. The snowfall had finally stopped, revealing a pale, desolate landscape. Danny was gone, and the guilt weighed heavily on Chuck as they drove away. He glanced at the forest one last time, half expecting to see the creature watching them. But the woods were still, their secrets hidden once again. Back in Denver, Chuck couldn't stop thinking about that night. He avoided the articles and forums he once obsessed over, unable to face the reality of what he'd seen. The Rockies, once a source of comfort, now felt threatening, their vastness a reminder of the creature's domain. The Appalachians had left their mark on him, a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. The shadows of the spring forest. George Davidson loved the Midwest. Growing up in Wichita, Kansas, he was no stranger to open fields stretching endlessly under the vast sky. Wichita wasn't just home, it was where life felt simple. The bustling small-town atmosphere, the smell of wheat on the breeze, and the quiet nights made it easy to feel connected to the land. But as much as he loved his home, George craved adventure. The idea of towering forests, gushing rivers, and the unknown had always intrigued him. So when his friends proposed a spring camping trip to Michigan's Huron-Manistee National Forest, he jumped at the chance. The group consisted of George, his best friend Alex, Alex's girlfriend Jenny, and their mutual friend Carl. They planned to spend 3 days exploring the wilderness, fishing in the crystal-clear streams, and enjoying the beauty of the reborn spring forest. The first day was idyllic. The forest was alive with birdsong, the scent of blooming wildflowers, and the gentle rustle of fresh green leaves in the breeze. They set up camp in a clearing near a secluded lake, its surface shimmering under the midday sun. George felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in months. Wichita had been kind to him, but it lacked this feeling of being lost in something bigger than himself. As the day wore on, They fished, cooked their catch over the campfire, and laughed about old memories. That night, they sat around the fire, the crackling flames casting long shadows into the woods. George thought about his family, his mother's homemade pie during spring dinners, his dad teaching him to drive on those endless Kansas roads. It was a good life, but something about this moment felt irreplaceable. He was in the moment, and it felt perfect. But perfect doesn't last. The next evening, as twilight descended, George felt it first, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He scanned the tree line, half expecting to see a deer or maybe a fox. But the forest seemed unusually quiet, the lively chorus of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive silence. The others noticed it too. "Feels like something's watching us," Jenny said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex laughed nervously. "Maybe it's a bear. They're waking up this time of year." George didn't respond. His mind wandered to the game he'd played a few months back, a survival horror title featuring Bigfoot as the antagonist. It was silly, he knew, but sitting here, surrounded by endless woods, it didn't seem so far-fetched. Later that night, as they sat around the fire, George caught the first glimpse. A shadow moved just beyond the firelight, impossibly large and deliberate. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" Alex asked. "Something big," George said. "Right over there." He pointed, but the shadow was gone. They stared into the darkness for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. Finally, they laughed it off and went to bed, chalking it up to George's imagination. But George didn't sleep well. The faint rustling outside the tent kept him awake, and every time he closed his eyes, he felt the same prickling unease. The following morning, Carl was gone. They found his tent ripped open, his belongings scattered. His phone and boots were missing, but there were no signs of a struggle, just deep, heavy footprints leading into the woods. "We need to find him," Jenny said, panic creeping into her voice. "We stick together," George said firmly. "No splitting up." They packed their essentials and followed the tracks, their hearts pounding. The forest, which had seemed so inviting yesterday, now felt suffocating. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made them jump. Hours later, they found Carl's phone near a creek. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. The last photo he had taken sent chills down George's spine. It was blurry, but unmistakable. A hulking figure covered in dark, matted hair, its face obscured but its massive frame dominating the frame. "We need to leave," Jenny said, her voice trembling. George nodded. "We'll head back to the car and get help." The way back was a nightmare. The creature was stalking them. Its guttural growls echoed through the forest, growing closer with each passing hour. At one point, Alex tripped on a root, and George had to pull him up before the creature closed the gap. As night fell, they were forced to stop. Exhausted and terrified, they built a fire and sat huddled together, their backs to the flames. The creature prowled the perimeter, its glowing eyes reflecting the firelight. It didn't attack, but its presence was enough to keep them on edge. George thought about his family again, his mom's laughter, his dad's steady voice. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. The fear was almost too much to bear, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We'll get out of this," he said, more to himself than anyone else. At dawn, they made their move, abandoning anything that would slow them down. The creature chased them, its massive strides shaking the ground. Jenny was the first to falter, but Alex and George pulled her along, refusing to leave her behind. When they finally reached the car, it was like a miracle. They piled in, George slamming the gas pedal to the floor. In the rearview mirror, he saw the creature standing at the edge of the forest, its massive form silhouetted against the rising sun. It didn't follow. Back in Wichita, George couldn't stop thinking about the trip. Carl was still missing, and the police had found no evidence of the creature. But George knew what he'd seen. The woods had their secrets, and Bigfoot was one of them. He vowed never to return, but the memory would haunt him forever.